Welcome, and thank you all so much for being here. So just a little bit about this forum. When we began creating this forum, we knew domestic violence was an issue that's prominence seemed so large it couldn't possibly grow. However, under COVID, cases have surged 35% between July of 2019 and June of 2020. I felt a personal responsibility to learn more about this issue and bring awareness to this topic, and I'm so thankful that Michael Barron and Lynn Lilly felt the same pull and worked with me to make this happen. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator of the evening, Alexandria Ruden. Alexandria Ruden is Senior Attorney with the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, specializing in domestic violence representation. She's a statewide and national lecturer and trainer on dynamics of domestic violence in the law and a consultant to various legislators, judges, and other professionals on Ohio domestic violence law and legislation. Ms. Ruden is on Supreme Court of Ohio Advisory Committee on Domestic Violence and the Supreme Court of Ohio Subcommittee on Abuse, Neglect, and Dependency. She's also on the Cuyahoga County Domestic Violence Shelter Advisory Board and the Violence Against Women Act Grant Allocations Committee for Cuyahoga County.
Thank you, and thanks to all the participants who are feeling that this is such an important topic. And thank you to the Shaker Heights League of Women Voters for hosting this forum on such an important topic, and to Ruby, who had the idea to bring everyone together. In fact, home may not be safe for many families who experience domestic violence, which may include both intimate partners and children. It is even more important today because of COVID and the rise in cases of domestic violence and child abuse over the past year. To be clear, COVID does not make an abuser, but COVID exacerbates it. It gives abusers more tools, more chances to control one's partner. The abuse was going to happen anyway, but now for that victim, there is nowhere to go, nothing to do, and that victim is at the mercy of the system. Studies are just confirming what we have known for the past year, that staying at home, often unable to call for help, being locked down, being without a job or school, have caused an increase in DV cases throughout the country and here at home. For many, resource options, shelters, DV and child abuse programming, access to courts and police might not be readily available to those survivors who are forced to stay at home. Interestingly, compliance with a stay-at-home order for COVID has decreased options for families in cases in which the home is unsafe. Add to this poverty, isolation, economic and psychological stressors, which all increase negative coping mechanisms and then come together in a perfect storm to trigger a wave of family violence. As serious abuse has increased, calls to hotlines and visits to emergency rooms have increased exponentially. Unfortunately, the true detrimental impact on resources has been felt across the state. Budget cuts to federal programs such as VOCA and VAWA, changes to how shelters house people. Overall, there has been a lag in court filings, which could be due to survivors weighing the risk of staying in an abusive relationship versus the uncertainty of the pandemic. Since this forum brings together highly trained people whose professional lives intersect with survivors, it is important that we be on the same page. Thus, it's important to understand why we have laws on the books relating to domestic violence. Until the 1970s, the response to a battered woman's cry for help was often met with silence. Now, I recognize that men have been abused and they continue to be abused, and the rate is increasing. But on balance, domestic violence is still a gendered crime. No term for intimate partner violence existed in the national lexicon in the 70s. Virtually no shelters or safe houses for battered women had been established, and no laws had been enacted to address the immediate aftermath of an abusive incident. And government had a long track record of denying there was even a problem. The civil rights movement began the modern change. The women's movement then of the 60s and early 70s challenged traditional notions of relationships, thereby leading the way for the emergence of the domestic violence movement. A community response in the form of shelters provided the backdrop for this social change. A recognition by activists that the laws on the books provided little relief for victims of domestic violence was the catalyst for effective legal advocacy. Over the next several years, all statutes began to develop. Statutes designed to specifically address domestic violence is a crime, meant to intrude into family dynamic, to stop violence in the home. Ohio's statutes were enacted in 1979, but over the past 40 years, they have evolved. The 80s saw a network of domestic violence programming formed in part to take on the challenge of pressuring social and legal institutions to respond to the plight of battered women and victims of domestic violence. The next steps were the creation of and modernization of the laws to address a previously inadequate response. The 1990s proved to be a watershed decade focused on toughening penalties, refining laws, and identifying and correcting gaps in the justice system. The research of the 80s was just being compiled, and the results informed the next decade. So just a few pieces of historical timeline. In 1991, the legislature enacted the Battered Woman Syndrome defense for women who were accused of murdering their husbands, but they were victims of domestic violence. Then domestic violence became a best interest factor for purposes of custody. Then we had the introduction of the stalking laws after the death of Sherry Lockwood in Lakewood, Ohio. Then we recognized that there was ineffective law enforcement response, ineffective hospital response, ineffective judicial response. And so in 1994, two things happened. We had I guess it was House Bill 335 that passed, and the Violence Against Women Act. And what is interesting, these have been extremely comprehensive laws, probably the most comprehensive to date, and I'm saying until 1994. Then the Supreme Court of Ohio in 1994 convened a task force to monitor the laws enacted. And then in 1997, Senate Bill 1 strengthened protection orders. Then we had civil stalking protection orders. Then in 2000, we had standardized protection order forms that we used around the state. And in 2000 and to date, we've had bail factors, lethality factors specific to dangerousness of victims of violence, dating violence, sexual violence protection orders, juvenile protection orders. And all these gains have culminated in a bill drafted by our next speaker, Representative Jeanine Boyd, which bill, if enacted this term, would be the most comprehensive piece of legislation since 1994. And before Jeanine Boyd speaks, let me tell you a little bit about her. State Representative Jeanine Boyd is currently serving in her third two-year term in Ohio's 9th House District, where she is a lifelong resident. She has almost 2 decades of experience in health and human services advocacy and policy, and has been actively involved in the state budget process on behalf of programs that serve our most vulnerable citizens. Representative Boyd is a former Cleveland Heights Council member, where she worked on mentoring and juvenile diversion programs and was the catalyst for the expansion of human rights laws. Representative Boyd serves as a treasurer of the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus and sits on the board of the Ohio Children's Trust Fund, Ohio's sole dedicated public funding source for child abuse and neglect prevention. She is a strong advocate for our most vulnerable citizens and victims of domestic violence. She has served on the Speaker's Task Force on Poverty and Education. She is a trustee on the board for the Heights Emergency Food Center, and she's on the board for Beaumont Catholic High School. She is also my state representative. Representative Boyd, we are honored to have you.
That almost brought tears to my eyes. I feel the same way about you, Alexandria. I'm honored to be introduced by you. Hopefully you all can hear me. I'm at Cleveland Clinic. My father is here in the hospital. So forgive me for all the beeps and sounds and any flashing lights that occur. And for the mask, hopefully I speak as clearly as possible and you have no issue hearing me. So I'm honored to speak about this issue of domestic violence that is, to me, a continuous public health crisis. It really impairs family stability and children's development and the health of so many victims and survivors. And you know, when your health is impacted, the rest of everything is impacted, work, school, everything. So to me, that's a crisis. I appreciate the way Alexandria spoke about the pandemic, and happy to talk about what I was able to do in response to the pandemic, at least in this last, in our transportation budget this year. But first, I'd like to get to House Bill 3 because I know that I'm limited in time. House Bill 3, which we've called now Aisha's Law. And for those of you who don't know the story of Aisha Fraser, formerly Fraser Mason, her ex-husband was a legislator for a number of years and then a judge. And both of them, my constituents, along with her family and children. She was a school teacher, an only child like myself, very close to her parents, who I've had the incredible honor of coming to know a bit through the bill process. You know, a beautiful woman who, you know, loved teaching and loved her children and loved her parents dearly and loved her community, her sorority, Delta Sigma Theta, which my mother is a member of. And was just a true treasure to so many. And she was brutalized in her marriage, and once divorced in what was supposed to be a supervised child visit and exchange or drop off, was brutally murdered by her then ex-husband, who now is in prison for life. So he went from lawmaker to the bench, where he interpreted law and served people, to being on the other end of that now in prison for snuffing out a life too soon. House Bill 3, named after Aisha, does not aim to end domestic violence. I don't know what bill would do that. There's so many layers to domestic violence. What House Bill 3 does is aim to triage, if you will. I wrote it, I drafted it in the spirit of healthcare, really. When we think of the goals of most healthcare systems, it's to create a continuum of care. So what Aisha's Law aims to do is create a continuum of strengthened protections for survivors of the most lethal, that are in the most lethal situations, where end of life or homicide is likely the approaching result. To get them to engage them in a continuum that provides a safe way out. So it begins with the lethality screening tool. There are 2 that have been approved by the Department of Justice, and therefore Ohio Attorney General's office accepts them. And they are just a rough number of questions, anywhere from 4 to 11 questions that are extremely important, that when they're answered, depending on the answers, it indicates the level of danger that the survivor is in. And from that point, an automatic referral, if they respond in the affirmative to those questions, an automatic referral to a program, domestic violence program in that community, county, or region, the closest possible, and an advocate automatically assigned through that program to help someone go through the rest of the processes, whether it's relocation, getting a child pulled out of a school or childcare, whatever the next steps are, court. We do a number of things of other things through the bill, and the bill goes all the way to the court. I'm very proud of one piece that we had in the bill originally, but later removed and offered as a proposal to the Ohio Supreme Court, and they are considering it now. And that is to expand the kinds of evidence that can be considered in domestic violence cases. And that would be huge. That was done around child abuse cases, several years ago, and it has impacted that effort. So we'd like to see that impact the efforts of keeping survivors alive and safe. To know where we are with the bill, it's important to understand the committee process, the democracy that you live in, right? I introduced this bill in the House. It passed out of the Criminal Justice Committee, to which it was assigned, unanimously. It took some time, and it was, before the pandemic. Pandemic, just like everything else, has impacted our committee process. But before the pandemic hit, we did pass it out of the House. And then it went to the Finance Committee because it includes police training on the lethality screening tool and the protocol that the bill creates. Everything from emergency protection orders to understanding strangulation and the impact on a survivor, and encouraging the survivor to seek medical attention right away if strangulation has been either reoccurred or occurred per the survivor's report. Those sorts of things are critical to ensuring the success of this of the effort of Aisha's Law to protect and save the lives of survivors. So it requires training for our law enforcement. And I always believe that, training that creates opportunity for understanding what's happening in someone's life can address so many things that we know are wrong. So it was important to get funding for the training, and we did. I was able to do that. And I think this is something taxpayers should know, because I think taxpayers look for this, right? I was able to bring together the governor's office, the attorney general's office, and the criminal justice services of the state to sit down and look for the money and find it. And they did. So that money was allocated and approved by the Finance Committee, and then the bill passed out of that committee also unanimously. And then it went to the House floor, and we were able to, my colleague and I, my joint sponsor and I, were able to convince our colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote for it, and it passed out of the House unanimously. Then it went to the Senate, and then the pandemic happened. And so everything slowed down, and it was out of our control. Every time we, start back up, the Senate would shut down because of someone being diagnosed with COVID or exposed. And so they had to cancel committees. We didn't get hearings until much later in the year. September was our first hearing. This was last year. And we had a second hearing in October. Again, between the first hearing and second hearing, the Senate had shut down for 2 weeks because of someone being identified with COVID, more than one person, I think, at that point. So we were delayed, and lame duck session happened. The thing about lame duck is that it's a time often when bills turn into what they call Christmas tree bills, and all sorts of unrelated policy could be meshed into bills that people, certain folks know are going to pass, so they can get their stuff passed that maybe wouldn't get the kind of support necessary to pass independently. And that's a dangerous thing. And I mean, the last thing I would ever want is to have Aisha's law contaminated with something that actually hurts people versus helps people. So we protected it. We held it close to our vests, and we had a lot of offline conversations with the Senate and the House, with House members. My joint sponsor and I, there was a possibility at one point, but then it just wasn't worth it to take the chance. So we have reintroduced it this General Assembly. We're in a new General Assembly now, and we've reintroduced it. We are working on getting a hearing next week. This week was the state budget. So we wanted to let that move forward, but we are working with the chair to get a second hearing next week. So we did have a first hearing. I want to say that was February or March. I don't remember now. I think it was March, early March. We had our first hearing. So the first hearing is always just the so to speak authors of the bill, the joint sponsors. So myself and my joint sponsor and I testified and answered questions about the mechanics of the bill, et cetera. The next hearing will be, depending on the chair, it could be all proponent or all opponent, or he could do all proponent and opponent. So people who are for and against the bill, it's up to the chair. It's the chair's discretion. And again, it's in Criminal Justice Committee. Some of the same people that voted for it last General Assembly are on that committee, and then some new folks to the House are in that committee. So the education process, the testimony process is still important. People who are interested in testifying and being a witness, it's still important because you have so many new people on the committee. And believe it or not, I'll say this, and I know I'm probably out of time and happy to answer questions about the bill and the mechanics. And when I have to jump off, Ethan, who is my legislative assistant, and really, he and I worked on this bill. I mean, there were late nights, and texts at all times of the day and the mornings for the last 2 years about working on this bill. A lot of late and long days, and work with the LSC and of course with Alexandria and our other stakeholders. But the fact of the matter is, when I first started having conversations with members of the House and Senate about House Bill 3 and asking them, answering questions one-on-one and asking them to consider co-sponsoring and voting for the bill, I had several members say to me that it was such a shocking case, and that sort of thing never happens in their district, domestic violence. And we know that is not true, right? There is not a corner of the world where domestic violence is not happening. And I was so stunned. All I could say to those members that said that to me was, please reach out to your local law enforcement and ask them how many calls they get a week or a month that are DV. And 2 of them did and came back to me, and they were stunned, and they lived in much smaller communities. And they were stunned that they had so many, not only that they had DV calls, but that there were so many. And one person even said, I knew a family. I found out later that was one of the calls. She said, I was so stunned. So this, people have there's still a lot of educating to do, and as Alexandria talked about the history of bills and policies, we got a long way to go. We're climbing, it's like a climb. So we still have a long way to go. So I'll end with that and say again, thank you to having me on.
Representative Boyd, there are a few questions. One is, how is this bill this year different from the one that did not pass last year?
We did make a few technical changes. For instance, I don't know if you'd call them technical, but we did make a few technical changes, but we also included the state troopers, for instance. They were left out of the group of law enforcement originally that would get the training. But state troopers do respond to domestic violence calls. I think we did even more so smooth out the emergency protection order process in a way that ensures that everyone is that people understand that it is effective, right? It's in effect, period, for the amount of time until the person can get to court, for the survivor can get to court for a full hearing and have a non-temporary TPO or protection order issued. And there might have been a few others, and I apologize. Even that beeping is even disturbing me. Ethan, it can answer more specifically. I think there were like 3 or 4, maybe 5, 3 or 4 others besides the 2 I mentioned. Ethan,
Well,
did you want to add any? The ones we did in the Senate. Do you remember?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. So the bill from last General Assembly is pretty much the same as the representative stated. We went through and made some technical changes just to make sure that all of the codes aligned and referenced the appropriate areas of the Ohio Revised Code. And as the representative said, we just changed some of the timeframes for the EPO to ensure that the respondent and the defendant, the alleged perpetrator, are both made aware of it, and to ensure that a civil protection order or criminal protection order can be the individual can get that. And so there's no lapse in time. But other than that, the language is pretty much the same. And if you go to legislature.ohio.gov, you can search House Bill 3 and you can see the analysis and the full language. And the office email has been put into the chat, so please don't hesitate to reach out to our office with further questions.
Okay, thank you. And has there been any opposition to this bill so far?
Well, we'll know better when we get our next hearing. In the past, there was opposition from, yes, I mean, mostly from courts. I mean, honestly, and from prosecutors, there was some opposition. But I think that as we went through the process, we were able to educate more. And as we moved through the committee process, we gained more allies of some of our most unlikely, our original critics on the other side of the aisle, for instance, especially on the majority side of the aisle. Some of the critics became our biggest champions after they, started reviewing the bill, talking to their law enforcement, talking to their constituents. They came back and they really have been some of our greatest supporters. So we'll see who shows up to oppose. In the Senate hearings, there were none. There were no opponents. The second hearing was all testimony and no opponents. There may have been one interested party, which the interested party just means they were neutral. In other words, they thought perhaps they might tweak some things, but other than that, they liked the bill. But there were 2 very strong proponents, so folks who were in favor of the bill passing, who testified in the Senate hearing. Alexandria and I watched that and were talking during that. And yes, we were able, they were very strong testimonies, as strong as the House testimonies that we had from roughly 15 proponents that made their way there to testify back in 2019. So far, we don't know, but we'll see. We'll see who shows up.
Thank you. And I have 2 more questions of you. And one is, we know that strangulation is a high risk factor for homicide. Is there anything in the bill that addresses strangulation?
Yes, that was one of our, and that actually was one of the things that we did have some pushback from originally, because everyone wants us to redefine, everyone wanted us to redefine, not everyone, certain people wanted us to redefine it. We took the definition of strangulation right from the Violence Against Women Act. So it's best practices, right? It's the original and most appropriate definition. So we were not interested in changing the definition. We've had some very interesting responses to it from folks. Some of the questions have been very strange, honestly. And wanting us to only have it applied to certain members of families instead of, open to whomever it is doing the strangulation and in the household. So yes, it addresses strangulation. It creates a, and forgive me, I don't sleep. I haven't slept in a while, so I might miss terms, but it creates tell me, Ethan, it creates that didn't exist before it adds strangulation as
it's a standalone offense rather than being
offense.
considered a misdemeanor or felony assault. So that way it
Perfect.
has more teeth.
Thank you. That is what it does. And we have support from the governor's office on that language. And I'm very grateful for that. We're the last state to do it. And it's absurd that it's taken this long. And again, part of the police training, which is the other thing I'm very proud of, is the piece that will talk about strangulation and the impact of strangulation on the health of the survivor or victim, and how important it is for that person to seek medical attention as quickly as possible. So that is also part of the bill, and we're very proud of that.
Okay, and lastly, you had mentioned when you first started your involvement with the budget bill and what you have done in the area of helping to fund some of the domestic violence programming. Would you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Thank you for that question, Alexandria, as well. We've only passed the transportation budget so far in this General Assembly. So just so you all know, because it's important to understand your government, your state government looks like your United States government. You've got your Ohio House, just like you have the US House. You've got your Ohio Senate, just like you have the US Senate, and have the executive office. In the state, it's the governor, and the Congress, it's the president, right? So we all have budgets. The federal budget is every year. I still lobby on that, so I understand that process well too. And then the state budget is on a biennium, so it's every other year. And it's actually the odd years we do the operational budget. So it's 2021, we're doing the operational and transportation budgets. In 2022, we'll do another capital budget, capital projects. So this is Shaker League of Women Voters, for instance, the Van Aken Shopping Center that we all love so much. That was those were my first two capital budgets. I was able to acquire the funding necessary to complete that particular project. So that's an example of capital projects. So in this budget, we have transportation budget. That's done. We actually knocked it out, which was really actually impressive with the pandemic. We weren't delayed with that. And one of the things I did was we drafted an amendment to create funds specifically for transportation needs for survivors. So the Ohio Domestic Violence Network was awarded in the transportation budget money that is specifically for survivors and victims to access so that they can get to any appointments they need, medical appointment, related appointments, medical appointments, court appointments, treatment or therapy or counseling or support appointments. And, and it's enough money to cover anything from, gas cards to gas cards to vouchers for public transportation or shared transportation. It is the only Democratic amendment that the Republicans accepted in the transportation budget. So I'm very proud of that as well. Thank you for asking about it.
You're very welcome. And again, Representative Boyd, unless you have anything else you want to add, I think this concludes your part, and we hope that your father is in good shape and gets better quickly.
Sending prayers, State Representative, really, and hugs and love.
I forgot you were on. Hey, Judge.
Really.
Thank you. Thanks, you guys.
Okay,
Thanks. Stay well.
you too, thank you. All right, and now we turn our attention to Judge Francine Goldberg. She serves in the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas Domestic Relations Division in Cuyahoga County, Ohio. She has served in that capacity since 2014, where she has presided over hundreds of domestic relations cases, and I know because I practice in that court. Prior to being a judge, she was an assistant Cuyahoga County prosecuting attorney for over 24 years. A three-term University Heights councilwoman, Goldberg served 4 years as vice mayor. The Cuyahoga County Domestic Relations Judge was named Public Servant of the Year for the city of University Heights in 2013. Judge, you're on.
Well, thank you very much, Alexandria. You are actually and continue to be one of my role models in this area. And I think Ruby Cover, who initiated this program tonight, she is really taking on the torch to have a young woman that's in high school to be so passionate about creating this program. Really, for me, that's the next generation of leadership in this field. And Alexandria, you have been such a leader in this field for judges, for prosecutors, public defenders, and for our community. And really, that's in your DNA. And you've really been a mentor and a role model, and you don't like, to take the credit for any of that. But really, our thanks go out to you because you've really been a selfless public servant. And I hope you're going to be doing this at least another 30 or 40 years. We need you. So, but that being said, so I'm going to quote from To Kill a Mockingbird when Atticus Finch said to Scout, I believe, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his or her point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around it." Now, listen, it takes a lot of courage to come forward on these cases. And Representative Boyd spoke about how certain legislators didn't think that these kinds of issues, these kinds of domestic violence cases that escalate to homicides happen in their backyard or in their families. And domestic violence really knows no socioeconomic backgrounds, knows no color of skin or profession. This goes across any and all backgrounds. And just to kind of go through some stats that I think everyone should be aware of, and these are just general stats that I pulled. 3, the number of women murdered every day by current or former male partners in the United States. Over 38 million, the number of women who have experienced physical, intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. Women with disabilities are 40% more likely to experience intimate partner violence, especially severe violence, than women without disabilities. Over almost 5 million, the number of women in the United States who experience physical violence by an intimate partner every year. The 1,509, the number of women murdered by men they knew in 2015. Every minute, 20 people are victims of intimate partner violence. 18,000, the number of women who have been killed by men in domestic violence disputes since 2003. 1 in 4, the number of women who will be victims of severe violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. 1 in 7, the number of men who will be victims of severe violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Worldwide, men who were exposed to domestic violence as children are 3 to 4 times more likely to perpetrate intimate partner violence, as adults than men who did not experience domestic abuse as children. So they replicate that behavior. 8 million, the number of days of paid work women lose every year because of abuse perpetrated against them. So these numbers are dramatic. A woman is beaten every 9 seconds in the United States. Over 18 million, the number of mental health visits due to intimate partner violence. Again, intimate partner violence is the leading cause of female homicide and injury-related deaths during pregnancy. I mean, these numbers are dramatic. Black women experience intimate partner violence at rates 35% higher than white women. And another statistic that's, just staggering is that 92% of female firearm deaths are caused by a known perpetrator. So clearly these numbers are dramatic. And I think having town halls and education and different laws actually to educate younger people is so important. Now, Alexandria, you were part of when the domestic violence unit started way back when in 2010 in our court. Excuse my dog, who's RBG, who's barking, someone's at the door. There were 1 or 2 people working, and we had received a violence against women grant. And unfortunately now the only grant that we are receiving is a tech grant, because we are a model court for other courts to see in terms of how we handle domestic violence, civil protection orders and things of that nature. But we have 11 dedicated domestic violence staff members and 1 full-time advocate from the Journey Center for Safety and Healing, which was formerly known as the Domestic Violence Child Advocacy Center. I wanted to share with you also some statistics that I think are very powerful. Now, you should know when we talk about these cases, about 80% are pro se or self-represented litigants that come to the domestic violence center in our courthouse on the ground floor. Now, what we did a number of years ago under the leadership of Judge Gold, we created a help center, which is different from the domestic violence unit, but to help pro se or self-represented litigants navigate through this process. We cannot provide legal advice, but we can assist them with all the paperwork that's necessary. I think it's important that our community knows the good work that these 11 dedicated staff members are doing and the 1 full-time advocate are doing. And all 5 judges have oversight in terms of what takes place there. But the numbers are just very, very powerful. When we talk about, let's just talk about when the unit was started in 2010, there were approximately 469 filings. At that point, the percentage of self-represented litigants was about 49%. Every year, that number has increased. At one point in 2014, there were 743 total filings, and 80% were self-represented litigants. Now, the numbers that I just received with regard to 2019 and 2020, you have to understand that individuals were not coming into the court. We have not closed that unit. It has been open during the entire period of this pandemic. And I have to tell you, we really have selfless employees that really are passionate about working with victims and educating them, providing wraparound services, things of that nature when someone comes into the court. In 2019, there were 701 new filings with about 611 self-represented litigants. In 2020, right now, we have figures of 609 new filings with about 548 self-represented. But again, you have to understand that during the pandemic, you had individuals that were under tremendous financial hardships. And also when you have partners that are in a home together and one individual feels, they might be afraid to come forward, or they might not be able to leave the home to go do what they need to do on the computer. Now, again, individuals in with regard to our domestic violence unit, they could email or fax or bring in the documentation to the domestic violence unit. And we also have laptops that are provided for individuals. And it's interesting too, because there are safety zone areas for a petitioner and for a respondent, and also a safety concern area as well, with cameras for the entire unit. If someone has a criminal background that might be, you know, a risk, or an individual might feel that they are a risk. This unit is petitioner driven as it relates to a domestic violence civil protection order. And as I said, we are open for business all of the time, as when the court is open, especially during this pandemic. We have to focus on, in terms of these domestic violence civil protection orders, the immediate and present danger of a domestic violence case. We talk about when these ex parte or these emergency domestic violence civil protection orders are granted, the court has the power to give exclusive possession of a home or a motor vehicle or even children to that individual person. It's not what can happen in the future, and it's not what can happen in the past. It's immediate and present danger, and it's not punitive. It is what is going on immediately and presently. Now, the other issue in terms of what we work with as well, when as a judge, I have to review any and all of these domestic violence issues that are signed by the magistrate. There are a number of consent agreements that both parties can come together on and agree to. But again, there are certain guidelines that are provided by the Ohio Supreme Court. But again, with an ex parte, when the paperwork is filled out, and it is, would you say, Ms. Ruden, it is a bit voluminous in terms of the paperwork that needs to be completed.
Yes, but I would also say that everyone in the DV department moves this process seamlessly. So even though a victim may take a few hours, they will end up on that same day obtaining a civil protection order.
Right. And I just wanted to, in some of the individuals that are listening to this, that lethality assessment is very important. And some of the questions that are on the lethality assessment are something like this. Has the physical violence increased in severity or frequency in the past year? Does he own a gun? That has a number of points for that in terms of lethality issues. Have you left him or her after living during the past year? Is he or she unemployed? Has he or she ever used a weapon against you or threatened you with a lethal weapon? Does he or she threaten to kill you? Has he or she been avoided being arrested for domestic violence? Do you have a child that is not his or hers? Has he ever or her forced you to have sex when you did not wish to do so? So, and then one of the questions is, did he ever or she ever try to strangle or choke you, illegal drug use, things of that nature? So it's fairly comprehensive. And again, it's petitioner driven. And again, civil protection orders can last up to 5 years. And the ex parte civil protection order can last for a year. And again, I think there's this synergy between the domestic violence unit and the judges that are on the bench. Again, if there's a divorce case pending or they have a domestic violence civil protection order, I have to be very cognizant of how that is going to play out in terms of parenting time, in terms of safety issues, in terms of transportation back and forth with a parenting plan. And where is this going to go long term? Have there been psychological evaluations done? So there is that type of communication that goes back and forth between the domestic violence unit and the judges. The other thing I wanted to impress upon the audience, as well as anyone that would listen to this, sometimes people say, well, how does law enforcement know about these domestic violence civil protection orders? There's something called a 10A, which is the way that our court talks to law enforcement agencies, and it's immediately sent to the National Crime Information Center. And without a 10A, the law enforcement will not enforce a civil protection order. And our court will issue one after an ex parte, a consent agreement, or after a full hearing. And this will prohibit that contact, and the 10A will include permissible contact if permissible, if pertinent. And without a modified 10A, the law enforcement database will not be updated. So that's why that's important, that their communication, which goes through the sheriff's office, is always updated. But again, this has, it's so important that we educate our young people, and it really takes a tremendous amount of courage for people to come in to tell their story. And that's why I think we have really a lot of dedicated people that work in the court to ensure that the safety concerns are met in a very, very timely manner.
Judge, there are some questions for you,
Sure.
specifically for you. One person wanted to know how long it takes a case to come before, I guess, the magistrate or the judge, and what protections a survivor of domestic violence would have while they're waiting.
Well, and that's an excellent question, because they do say that during that separation period, that's where the risk is the greatest. But again, as we stated, the ex parte is the same day. Once that is granted, and again, that can give you not ownership rights, but exclusive possession of home, of children, things of that nature. So that's the same day. And the initial hearing, if there is some possession rights being taken, that would be within 7 days. And if there is no possession, 10 if exclusive possession was not granted. So we run a pretty tight ship over there. And again, you know, the petitioner needs to know the address of the respondent in order for service to take place. I do know that our department sets a hearing at least 3 times before it's dismissed if for some reason service or there's no notification to that responding party. So I believe they will do everything in their power to do that, and as well as service by publication, which the court pays for to make that happen.
Somebody asked, assuming you don't do a civil protection order, we know that domestic violence exists even though people may be going through divorce. So the question that was asked is, what legal protections would a victim have while a case is pending before the court relative to a divorce? For example, access to accounts, access to home, personal property.
Well, again, you know, and you might want to touch on this too, Ms. Ruden, in terms of, you know, there's also the criminal courts. You know, this is a civil proceeding and it's petitioner driven. You know, we do, you know, again, you have criminal matters that other courts also, you know, in terms of recklessly causing bodily harm. I think that's a misdemeanor of the 4th degree. A misdemeanor of the 1st degree, or the threat of serious physical harm. You know, again, this is one avenue that you're looking at, but there's also the criminal avenue too. Would you agree with that, Alexandria?
Absolutely, which leads into one other question that people have for you. And what are, for example, they have misdemeanors or felonies, 1st and 2nd degree. They want to know a little bit more about what that means relative to violence, and what are the different levels of punishment, depending on whether somebody has been convicted of a misdemeanor versus a felony.
Well, it's you know, when I handled, you know, again, and maybe refresh my memory, because I haven't been in the prosecutor's office for about six and a half years, but I think once you have the 4th misdemeanor, I think that bumps it up to the felony 4. Is that correct?
It's 2, but yes.
It's the 2. Okay. I mean, listen, I mean, I think in terms of what we do, I mean, clearly, again, we're looking at a limited scope in terms of immediate and present danger, not future and not past. And again, you're talking about exclusive possession of a home, a motor vehicle, or children. And I think, and that's that the ex parte, and again, I think that again, these can escalate to much different things. I mean, the one thing that I will say, as a former prosecutor, I had a number of cases that started as domestic violence. One of the last cases that I had as a prosecutor, I had a husband that tried to kill his wife by using a wood shim and put it in the engine of her automobile. But for the grace of God, the car went through a nail salon, and she ended up living, but he was charged with attempted murder and other charges. Clearly, she didn't want to believe that he had done these things, or he wanted to kill her, or that intent. But I think it's really important to memorialize all of these incidents. If you are going to make a police report, I think it's important that again, you memorialize, file the report, and again, understanding, and Alexandra, if you want to talk about some of the ramifications with TPOs, but in terms of our world, we're limited in terms of the domestic violence civil protection order or a consent agreement where the parties come together. In the majority of our cases, there is a consent agreement as it relates to parenting and visitation and those kinds of issues, which is wonderful if the parties can agree. Many of our cases, though, once the petitioners filed the ex parte, sometimes there isn't the next step of moving forward.
I hear you. And Judge, this has been wonderful. And wouldn't you know, we have 1/2 hour left and we have 2 more speakers. So if you don't mind, we can move on to Meredith.
Sure.
And so much for your service and for what you do for victims and for the citizens of Cuyahoga County.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Meredith Turner is a graduate of Shaker Heights High School, a former special education teacher, and coach for the Cleveland Metropolitan and Shaker Heights City School Districts. She is a U.S. Senate alumni, having served over 10 years as a caseworker and community liaison for United States Senator Sherrod Brown. Meredith, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Alexandria. It's going to be hard to come behind my friend, the Honorable Frankie Goldberg. But one thing that stuck out from her presentation that I guess I want to share is I want to have this courageous conversation with you all. I'm not a lawmaker, although I've worked for one. I'm not the judge. I don't want to get into the policy, but I do have a story to share. And I'm going to start with, I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, the Greater Cleveland Alumni Chapter. And I serve as the Social Action Chair. And I also am a member of the Domestic Violence Committee. Lady Fortitude is a statue that sits on the campus of Howard University, and she symbolizes the attributes of strength, courage, hope, wisdom, beauty, and femininity as depicted by the 22 founders of our organization. She reminds us to move forcefully to meet the challenges of life. And basically, the definition of fortitude is having strength of mind that enables a person to encounter danger or bear pain or adversity with courage. With each day in Africa, a gazelle wakes up knowing that he must outrun the fastest lion or perish. And at the same time, a lion stirs and stretches, knowing that he must outrun the fastest gazelle or starve. It's no different for the human race. Whether you consider yourself a gazelle or a lion, you have to run faster than the other to survive. As human beings, we are vulnerable to confusing the unprecedented with the improbable. In our everyday experiences, if something has never happened before, we are generally safe in assuming it's not going to happen in the future. But the exceptions can kill you, and domestic violence is one of those exceptions. I am the daughter of Roschelle, and I lost my mom on January 15th of this year, so it hasn't even been 3 months. But I am the daughter of Roschelle, and I am the granddaughter of Edith. I am Mayor Edith. Just put M-E-R in front of Edith, and my grandmother is in my name. These are my ancestors. Mayor as a prefix means sea or marine. It can be applied to beings that are partly sea creatures. I was born in February and I'm a Pisces, so I must be a mermaid because I have no fear of depth and a great fear of shallow living. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my story. I held up my fan earlier of this beautiful woman. This is Aisha Fraser. Aisha and I went to middle school and high school together at Shaker Heights High School, and we became members of Delta Sigma Theta sorority together. And so I have her here with me, not only to honor her memory through my advocacy, but to give me strength as I have this conversation with you tonight. I've spoken publicly about my story, probably on 4 or 5 occasions. The sorority, we had a conversation after Aisha passed initially to just debrief, just to be in fellowship one with another, to comfort each other. We have Judge Allison Nelson Floyd and Judge Tanya Johnson Jones and Emanuela Groves, all judges, all members of our organization, and they were all present to kind of talk about the law side of this. But more than anything, we were there to just support one another. Alexandria, I've had the chance to be in fellowship with you in a couple of spaces when the Women of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated held their domestic violence forum a couple of years ago now, I think with more counseling. You gave an amazing historic presentation about domestic violence from, I mean, you was talking about Salem witches. You know, you were talking about how women have been viewed over time, how they weren't even considered, you know, persons, they were property. And you talked about the evolution of that women's movement, you know, gaining the right to vote and et cetera. And I wish we could have heard that from you tonight, because I had never thought about this subject along the timeline that you presented. It was brilliant. You are brilliant. I spoke at an event that the Regional Sewer District held for their employees. I was invited by Catherine Hall to speak about Aisha's law and give some updates. And I also gave testimony at the criminal justice hearing as State Representative Janine Boyd presented the bill. And as I stated, my relationship with Aisha was one of the things that, like, when Michael Barron asked me, when he invited me to talk with you tonight, I was like, oh, you know, this is not a conversation that I ever want to have. I never want to be on a panel like this. I never want to talk about this subject because causes me to, remember, what happened to me. It causes me to remember what happened to Aisha and all the feelings associated with that. But because the things that happened to me, I feel a responsibility to do this. And so I'm stepping out on courage and I'm stepping out on faith tonight just to share a little bit about, again, my story and why it's led me to do the advocacy work that I've been doing to try to help get Aisha's law passed. I mentioned my grandmother, Edith, earlier. I mentioned her because I lost her in 1985 to domestic violence. My grandfather murdered her. And I still don't know the whole story. It was so traumatic. I still haven't worked my way to learning all the details of what happened, but I do know it traumatized my family. I was in the 8th grade. My mother had just bought a home in Shaker Heights. We were moving. I was on my way to experience all that my mother had worked hard for, to get us out of the city. We lived on a street a block over from where Yvonne Pointer's daughter, Gloria, had been abducted from. And so it was around that time that, my mother was like, we're getting out of the neighborhood. And so unfortunately, that new start for us was marred, by the murder of my grandmother. And Alexandria mentioned, I worked as an educator, I've worked for a lawmaker, and I've had a very public life, but or I've been a very public figure at times, but I have a very private life. And in my private life, I myself am a survivor of domestic violence, not just what happened to my grandmother, but I had a sister who suffered from mental health issues, and she had been violent a lot of the times in my life. That's something that I'm still working to address, but I love my sister. And I was in a relationship. I had an intimate partner who was a narcissist to the 1000th degree. And I didn't recognize the red flags. Not initially, somewhere along the way, I knew that something was really wrong. And some things that I learned about narcissistic behavior is that they will work to invalidate your emotions. They will make you constantly trying to prove yourself. They will micromanage you and be overly controlling. They will belittle your achievements. They'll gaslight you. They will shame you and embarrass you in public. They will withdraw love and affection as a way of controlling your behavior. They will make you feel responsible for their emotions. They will use you for their own gain. They will second guess everything that you do and make you doubt yourself. They will mock your interest and perspective on things. My partner destroyed my college degree, tore it up right in front of me, shredded my sorority certificate. Obviously, I'll always have my education and can't take me out of my sorority, but those were symbols of things that meant something to me. They will erode your boundaries and pressure you into doing things that you don't want to do. They will blame you for things that aren't your fault. They will give you the silent treatment. They will manipulate you to do things that you don't want to do. And I don't want anybody out there listening to think that this could never happen to you, because I was educated, I had an amazing job and was doing all of these things. And I found myself in a situation that wasn't working out for me. And when I tried to leave that situation, I was assaulted. And I was assaulted in such a way that I was in shock. I was in shock because I realized at that point, not only did he not care about himself, but if he didn't care about himself, there was no telling what he was going to do to me. And so I had to figure out, I always, joke, when I'm telling this story that I Olivia poked myself, because it was around the time the scandal was out. And, there was just no way that I was going to get out of this unscathed. And I remember when I was trying to leave, and I was just, when a narcissist knows that you found them out, it gets really dangerous. It gets real dangerous. And I don't know what I was saying, but he hit me right in my mouth and split the whole top of my lip open. I could see, yeah. And so I went to the hospital, and I was sitting there, and they were taking forever to just even have me sign, the paperwork on a clipboard. And it was at that moment that I was thinking, I gotta get out of here, because I got a job. I do not want to be a news story. I don't want to be a social media. We had social media, but it's not like it is now. But I was like, no. And I left. And I don't know how, I guess by the grace of God, my lip healed. If you see me in person, you'll see the little scar there. But, I said all that to say that I feel guilty that I survived this situation. And I'm really sad that Aisha isn't with us anymore. And I know there are a lot of people who find themselves in these situations and they don't know what to do. I ended up in a courtroom in front of women that I admire. I had 2 judges recuse themselves because they knew me and I knew them personally and professionally. And I'm grateful that I've been able to survive this situation that I've been in. And that's why I am advocating. I'm not just advocating for, Aisha, but I'm advocating for myself. I just want people to know that, there is assistance out there, if you want it. I was an obstructionist. I didn't want to tell anybody. I didn't want to press charges. I just wanted him to go on with his life and leave me the hell alone. And gratefully that ultimately happened. But when Janine said that she was gonna, draft Aisha's law, was right there from the beginning. The sorority, I was mobilizing the D9, the Divine Nine. There are 5 fraternities, 4 sororities. We were writing letters, we were making phone calls, we were, putting posts on social media. Her Shaker community, her FAMU college university community. We were just like whatever we need to do to get this law passed so people can have protections. The lethality assessment, I took it. Oh my goodness, I was so at risk. And it could be anybody. So I guess that's just the tip of the iceberg of my story. And I think that's, about all the time that I have tonight. But, when you strip away all the titles and all the deeds, we're all just people, and it can happen to anybody. So I'm just grateful to still be here. And that's my story.
Been so courageous in telling that story. And when I hear you, you were once a victim, you became a survivor, but now you're a thriver. And I suspect that so many victims and so many survivors of violence will heed your story and will become that person that you have become. Thank you. And now I turn it over to the end with Roschelle. And I would like to tell you a little bit about her. Roschelle West Ogbuji. Oh, okay. As founding director of Community Chaplains and Champions in Northeast Ohio. As a community chaplain, she's involved in the provision of holistic care within non-religious institutions and communities. Prior to this, she was a director for religious services and volunteer for the state of Ohio Department of Youth Services, where she promoted trauma-informed care throughout the correctional system. She is a fierce warrior mother of 5 daughters and actively agitating systems of oppression. And I welcome Roschelle. Take it away.
Thank you. First and foremost, I want to thank everyone who was here and spoke about domestic violence. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. It's something I advocate for, but it's also, I am a survivor. And as Meredith was speaking, I was holding back tears because as you began to talk about narcissistic abuse, I was like, okay, I'm glad that you talked about it because I don't have to spend the time to talk about that. But I think it's important that everyone knows that no matter who you are, you can fall victim to domestic violence. And my story has a little bit of a different take to it because I had a trauma in our process. So I was married and had 3 amazing, beautiful little girls. And there was domestic violence. It started out verbal. And the thing that was really hard, like Meredith said, is that you don't really know that it's happening. There's a story about being put in how to kill a frog or boil a frog alive, is that you put it in a pot of cold water and you gradually turn up the heat. And what I realized is that after getting out of the situation is that there were signs from the beginning. And so there was physical violence, there was also verbal abuse. And so this had taken place for a couple of years. And then November, the day, it was Thanksgiving Day. Thanksgiving Day, there was an argument regarding food going over to parents' house. And I had a friend over and they ended up throwing all of my daughters, who was from my first husband, clothes all the way down the stairs. And I said, hey, I'm not going. It was at that moment, my girlfriend at the time, who was Asian, looked at me and said, you're in a domestic violence situation. And I say that because I didn't think Asian people had domestic violence, but she shared her story with me that she had been in a domestic violence situation with her parents. Her father was an abuser, and it was the first time she had let me know. And she's like, you need to call the police. And I did. And I made a report, but that was it. The next day I was going to leave him. And it was my daughter, Chica's birthday. She had turned 2. And I was going to leave him. And I called my parents, and my parents are of that generation that you stay married and you do whatever you need to do. And I had already been divorced. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm scared. I don't know how to make it as a single parent by myself. And so I didn't leave. He apologized and we went on. The next week, December 30th, we had family members. His family came from out of town. So he wanted to make up because we needed to be this family for his family. And we took them out to dinner. And that night we had a house fire. And I lost my 3 daughters in the house fire. And I vowed to myself that I was going to leave. And I did. After my girls died, I left. And he pursued me and pursued me and pursued me and told me that how could I not have changed after the death of our girls? And I came back, mainly because I wanted my children to look like my other children. So I'm going to be perfectly honest. I was traumatized. I had lost children. I was dealing with post-traumatic stress. And I could not imagine that this person had not changed. Well, what I learned is that people don't change. Had two more beautiful daughters, and gradually the verbal abuse started, the put down, the name calling, things that when I would tell my friends what was being said to me, it was hard for people to visualize this person saying these things, because what I can tell you is that every abuser isn't in a wife beating shirt, is not just this monster. They're charming. I mean, they're charismatic. They know how to present themselves in front of people that we know. I wrote a short story called Loving Monsters. And what does it mean to love a monster? And that's what a lot of people in domestic violence are doing, is that they're loving because they do love this person. It may be dysfunctional, it may be hurtful, but they do love them. And it's hard because one of the things that Meredith said is that what happens is when you've been traumatized and when you've been narcissistically abused, you literally look like the crazy one to everyone else because you're on edge. You're believing the hype because you've been brainwashed, and you're reacting to the things that you know are true that are happening behind closed door, but no one else knows it because no one's showing it. And one of the things is I was friends with Aisha, and we were in a domestic violence support group together. And one of the things that I can tell you is that what everyone said that really made it really, really hard is that no one could have imagined Lance doing the things that he did. But what happens is the person who knows that person behind closed doors knows all too well what that person is capable of, because they're smart. They know not to behave in a certain way in front of certain people because it's all about projecting the image. But what I found is the best way for survivors to be able to break free is to not be embarrassed. I've learned to put down my sachet of a certain type of behavior and to tell my story. In the African American community, everyone has seen me as a strong woman. You know, how you're a woman who could live through the death of girls. You could do this, you're successful, you're this, but your heart is a tender place. There's a scripture in the Bible that says, out of the heart comes the issues of life. Guard your heart. And I tell people to guard their heart now, because it's so important that we understand that it's not, when we're dealing with victims of domestic violence, we're trying to reason with their senses and their intellect. But it's not at that point that we need to reason with them. It is at a heart level, because that is where the victimizer has controlled them. And so I say that there's so many smart women, there's so many intelligent, powerful women that are afraid to come out of the closet, that are domestic violence survivors, because our image is the person who's getting hit in the face. But what happens is with narcissistic abuse, it usually gets the worst when you break away. I had the privilege of having a criminal domestic restraining order, and it lasted for a year, and it ended up going through the divorce process. But this is where my heart took over, is that I allowed him to plead down to a lesser charge. And he was able to seal that. And what I can tell you is that I advise women now that no matter how empathetic your heart is, and no matter how much someone is telling you, just let it go, always go for the harder or the most severe charges, because what happens is abusers never stop abusing. They find different ways to abuse, whether it's financial, whether it's psychological, whether it's using children. There is another way. They always find a way to still abuse. And so one of the advocacies that I do in my chaplaincy is really transparency, is to say, listen here, I've been there, done that. This is what you need to do. I know right now you love and you're thinking at this point, they're never going to do this, but let me tell you, you need to make sure that you do now what you need to make sure that's going to last for the future. Because I can tell you, and I share this story because I substitute taught, and I had a conversation with Aisha about a week before she died. And my ex-husband had an anaphylactic shock. And I saw it because we were at our daughter's soccer game, and I saw that he was going into anaphylactic shock, and I drove him to the hospital. And my joke to her was, he would have never done the same thing for me. And that's the heart of people that are not victimizers. And to know that just a week later, she died at the hand of her husband, her ex-husband. And so I say this is that always trust the people who have the intimate knowledge. And there's a situation even now where I have a mother who doesn't understand why her daughter isn't coming over. And she was really angry at her daughter. And immediately I said, I think your daughter is in a domestic violence situation. And as she began to describe it, I was just like, okay, your daughter is literally in a domestic violence situation. And just from talking to her and giving her advice about domestic violence and sending her to a website, she was able to use her tactics a little bit differently to talk to her daughter and to not be so, why aren't you leaving him? Why aren't you doing this? And it has been able to help bring this daughter back into more of a right relationship with her mom, so she can have more access to be able to get her out of that situation. So it's really important that we continue to have these conversations over and over again. And I know that we're at the end.
So what I would like, thank you, Roschelle,
Thank you.
my heart is with you. I do have one last question before I turn this over to Ruby to conclude the program. You had mentioned you had a criminal case. And
Yes.
I know that Judge Goldberg had one last point to make. And I will ask you, but have her respond. And that
Okay.
is, did you have a chance to make a victim impact statement in your case?
No, I did not have an opportunity to make a victim impact statement because we ended up talking, the prosecutor, ours was done in Shaker Heights and Randy Keller was the prosecutor. And he employed to me really that he didn't think this person would be a large threat. We had both gone through a traumatic loss. A lot of that, even though prior to the loss, there was still this activity. And I agreed, and my empathy came in, and I said, okay, I would agree to a lesser charge.
Without doing any statement.
Without doing a statement. And because like Meredith said, I just wanted to go about my business. I wanted to move on with my life. And I think a lot of times victims really want that type of process.
Okay, now and Judge, you had a point to make. You only have 1 minute because we're.
First of all, I just want to say, Roschelle and Meredith, you are truly heroes. And everyday heroes. And really, I can't thank you enough for sharing your story with all of us. And it's truly an inspiration in the work that I do, and I know that others do every day. I just wanted to share with everyone, I read the victim impact statement that this woman named Chanel Miller made. She was the victim in the Stanford University case of the swimmer in 2015. And she told the judge this, and I just wanted to read this. "And finally, to girls everywhere, I am with you. On nights when you feel alone, I am with you. When people doubt you or dismiss you, I am with you. I fought every day for you. So never stop fighting. I believe you." As the author Anne Lamott once wrote, quote, "Lighthouses don't go running all over an island looking for boats to save. They just stand there shining. Although I can't save every boat, I hope that by speaking today, you absorbed a small amount of light, a small knowing that you can't be silenced, a small satisfaction that justice was served, a small assurance that we are getting somewhere, and a big, big knowing that you are important. Unquestionably, you are untouchable. You are beautiful. You are to be valued, respected, undeniably, every minute of every day. You are powerful, and nobody can take that away from you. To girls everywhere and to victims everywhere, I'm adding that, I am with you. Thank you."
And to end this, all I can say is, Meredith and Roschelle, I am honored to be able to be with you while you shared your story. And to Judge Goldberg, thank you so much for what you had to say. And now I'm going to turn it over to the newest member of the domestic violence community, and Ruby Cover.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what Alexandria and Judge Francine Goldberg said. Thank you so much for your stories and vulnerability. I'm incredibly grateful. And thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing your stories and wealth of information. It was truly inspiring and incredibly moving. And thank you to our participants for joining us this evening and your excellent questions. If you would like to view a recording of this forum, it will be on the League of Women Voters Shaker website and Facebook page. And please join us for our next forum on April 29th, Equitable Public School Funding Now, Why It Matters and How to Get There. Thank you all and good night.